introduce ourselves. I'm Joel Lawson, and I'm the Associate Director for Development Review here at the DC Office of Planning. I see we have some other members, commissioners joining us as well, which is great. Welcome to all of you, and really appreciate your taking the time to have this conversation with us. We want to talk about two specific proposals that we're taking forward. The format's a little bit similar to some of the other open houses we've had on other recent text amendment cases that we've taken to the Zoning Commission, in that we'll be presenting where we're kind of at with the proposals. We're interested in getting your kind of initial take and feedback on some of these proposals that you may have, but also obviously part of this is just letting you know that we'll be taking these forward. As you all know, as experienced commission members, you know that this is just kind of the start of the process before the Zoning Commission. We've not even set these down yet. We've not filed a report with the Zoning Commission on either one of these cases. We are intending to file them fairly soon, so that they can be received by the Zoning Commission in July for set down. That, of course, means then that Jennifer, I just realized I spelt your name wrong. I'm sorry. It does mean that, it does mean that that it starts the Zoning Commission process, which will include, of course, additional outreach to ANCs and, of course, opportunities for you to talk directly to the Zoning Commission, at eventual public hearings, when the Zoning Commission does set them down. Given the timing of the commission, we wouldn't expect any public hearing to happen before the fall, probably October, possibly even later, depending on what their calendar looks like. So there's still a fair amount of process to happen. So anyways, I've introduced myself. Jennifer, if you'd like to introduce yourself as well.
I'm Jennifer Steingasser. I'm the Deputy Director with the Office of Planning for Development Review, Historic Preservation, and Urban Design. And I'll be representing the first case on rear additions to row houses. And also with us is Joshua.
Hi, I'm Joshua Mitchum. I'm a development review specialist with OP, and I'm assisting Joel and Jennifer on this project.
Great. Thanks to both of you. So unless somebody has a kind of an introductory question, and again, I want to welcome Commissioner Duncan and Commissioner Groth as well. Once again, we do appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation with us. If we can go to the next slide. You're going to see a couple of slides that are in here, really not for us to go over with you because you guys know all this stuff, but we will be making this presentation available on our website, both as a video and as a document. And we thought it might be helpful to, for some people who might see this presentation, to get just a little bit of a background of what zoning actually is. So we're not going to go over this one today with you guys. Next slide. So I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer. Thank you.
Thank you. So the first case is really focused on rear additions in those zones that allow for row houses and semi-detached. That's mostly the R2, the R3, and the RF zones. Next slide. So right now, the zoning regulations limit rear additions to no more than 10 feet past the rear wall of an adjoining property. So that's what's illustrated here on the left. Anything more than 10 feet can be approved by the Board of Zoning Adjustment through the special exception process. It's often referred to as a pop back. Next slide, please. So the Zoning Commission asked us to keep track of this text amendment and the BZA cases that were resulting from it. And we also had language introduced into the comprehensive plan that talked about the need for universal design, aging in place, removing zoning barriers to allow for those additions. And so this case has evolved from those two directions. Next. Slide, please. So what we're proposing after looking at the cases before the Board of Zoning Adjustment and the language in the comprehensive plan about universal design and barriers to zoning is to propose amendments to those zones, the RF, the R3, and the R2, to increase that matter of right addition from 10 feet to 16 feet. And that came from looking at the regulations regarding universal design, the building code requirements, which increase basically to 16 feet the amount of space necessary for wheelchair mobility around. We use typical bed, even though we know not every addition is a bedroom. To meet the objectives of aging in place and universal design. We looked at a queen size bed with a 5-foot turning radius and 3 feet mobility. And then we looked at most of the cases. I think there were a total of 63 cases in the last 10 years. We broke down those from the last 5 years in detail, and we propose amendments now to increase that to 16 feet from 10 feet. Properties would still be regulated by rear yard, lot occupancy, building height, and overall zoning regulations. Anything beyond 16 feet would still be subject to review by the Board of Zoning Adjustment through a public hearing. Next slide. And so this is basically what some illustrative examples of the proposal. The top one shows the 16-foot rear addition, and then anything beyond that, not to scale, obviously, is a special exception. The one on the bottom shows a situation where there's an existing building that's already further than 16 feet past an adjoining neighbor. And so any addition in that kind of a situation would be required by special exception. There would be no matter of right in that situation. Next slide. And that's pretty much all the proposal is to increase that 10 feet to 16 feet as a matter of right to allow for that universal and ADA. And if there's any questions at this point, I mean, obviously any report, when we file our report, there's a lot more data on the details of the cases that we've looked at. Okay. Oh, Joel?
Hi, thanks. So any questions, as Jennifer said, any questions on or any thoughts on that proposed change? Mark?
So Joel, I take it it's not just questions, but you're also looking for feedback.
Yep.
Yes.
I don't see any merit in this at all, honestly. It's for two reasons. One, this seems to not take any account of potential impacts on air, light, and privacy to adjacent neighbors. Also, I think it's worth bearing in mind that 16 or the 10 foot or 16 feet or whatever the limit is, does not take account of things like open porches. So you can have, significant impacts, even at 10 feet, but, because it's a rear wall measurement. And also the fact that you're going from 10 to 16 seems to me really, really radically increasing the potential for those impacts. So right now, unless I hear some more coherent argument for why you want to do this other than, oh, that's the typical size of a bedroom, which, as you note, not all such additions are going to be bedrooms. People can do, interior reorganization. They can move walls. They don't have to just tack on an entire room at the back. I'm going to be recommending to my colleagues that we strongly oppose this proposal.
Okay. Well, I appreciate the feedback. Your issue on open decks and screened-in porches, those would not be the measuring point. It would be enclosed conditioned space.
That's precisely my point.
Yeah.
Is you're having impacts on those exterior spaces, which, enjoy air and light and privacy. Mm-hmm. So they're already not taken account of with the current 10-foot rule. They wouldn't be taken account of with a 16-foot rule. And my point is that the impacts, with or without and unenclosed space are going to be markedly greater at 16 feet.
Okay, well, okay, I appreciate that feedback. And maybe a history of that 10 feet. 10 years ago, there was no limitation at all. The rear additions were permitted as a matter of right, subject only to lot occupancy and rear yards. So you could cover up to 60% of the lot by right with no regulation whatsoever. And during a case, there was concern raised with the issue of conversions that could have an extreme impact on neighbors. And so the zoning commission limited it to 10 feet without a lot of study at that point. There was no real, we didn't get a lot of feedback from architects until after the regulations were adopted. And then there was a lot of concern raised about the practicality of 10 feet. And so the zoning commission asked us to monitor that. And so that's why we started monitoring to see what cases were being filed, what were being approved, and overwhelmingly, they were all being approved. 45% of them would qualify as being within the 16 feet, and all of those had recommendations of approval from the ANCs, and the BZA ultimately approved them. So that's why we kind of looked at that whole body of evidence and came up with the 16 feet. Ms. Duncan?
Hi, thank you. I just have a question about moving to the 16 feet. You know how I'm assuming that everyone needs a 25-foot rear yard setback. Like, do you think the 16 feet is going to encroach on?
No. It's specifically in addition to those additional requirements. So the 16 feet does not allow you to exceed the 60% lot occupancy or encroach into any of the required rear yards.
Okay, I do find it interesting, the fact that it used to be unlimited and then it went to 10. So I guess to me, the 16 doesn't seem totally unreasonable at all, in my opinion.
Yeah, it is quite the swing. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you. Any other questions at this point? If not, Josh, we can move to the next slide. So the kind of more expansive of the two proposals is definitely this omnibus proposal. In this one, OP is proposing kind of a whole series of discrete text amendments as part of one case. It's simply to facilitate the review by the zoning commission, by you all, by the ANCs, and by members of the public. Each one of them is a relatively discrete text amendment. And so that's why we decided to pull them into one document, one proposal that we'll be taking forward to the commission, and the word omnibus seemed to make some sense. They do vary. The proposals, as you'll see, do vary in scope and in intent, but in general, they're intended to add clarity to the zoning regulations, to remove barriers, unnecessary barriers to housing, and the provision of lower cost housing. To ease administrative burdens for homeowners, as well as for the BZA and staff members, and also to ANCs in terms of the volume of BZA cases you deal with. And some of them are just simply updating the 2016 zoning regulations to current policy or to current standards. We worked very closely on these with the zoning administrator's office in the Department of Buildings. We also worked with the Office of Zoning, with DDOT, with Department of Environment, with Department of Parks and Recreation, and with others on coming up with these proposals. Now, a lot of the suggestions for the changes in the omnibus came from us here in OP, but many of them actually came from the Zoning Commission and BZA members themselves. And I'll be pointing some of those out. Some of them came from ANCs and community members and business groups and individuals. Through a lot of those came through BZA cases. So we spent a fair amount of time looking at BZA cases and the comments that were raised as part of those. In this proposal right now, we have 24 separate text amendments, as noted in the invitation to the meeting. And I know that's a lot. So I'm probably going to keep my comments to a relatively high level, talking about the more kind of substantive changes. In many of these, we're also proposing, very minor kind of technical changes or corrections or updating wording or making wording consistent. Probably not going to spend a lot of time on that right now. Of course, as we finalize the proposal, that will all be included in the draft text, which will be available in our report, and we'll be sending that out to all of you as well. As we go through this, we will be taking a break every few slides to receive your questions or comments on those slides that we've just gone over. So with that, I think we'll just kind of dive right into it with the next slide, Josh. Oh, sorry. This is basically just repeating everything I just said. So we can skip over this one. Thanks. So the first amendment that we want to talk about are some clarifications to properties that are split zoned. Typically, of course, zone boundary lines don't run down the middle of properties. They run down the center line of the streets or the alleys or along property lines. And it's certainly, we try to avoid the creation of lots that are split zone now because they can be difficult for people to understand what they can even do on them. However, sometimes they are created even now through subdivisions, but certainly a number of them already exist in many parts of the city. Not a lot of them, but enough that they do create problems for people. Now, sometimes even when it's split zoned, a building can be constructed on the different portions of the property with the different portions of the building conforming to the zoning on that portion of the property. But sometimes that's not possible, particularly if one of the zones in the split zone property is one of the low density residential zones because the provisions are so different on those properties. So we're proposing to provide some additional clarity, provide a little bit more flexibility in terms of how you calculate that density on those properties. There's a bit of redundant language that we want to get rid of. I think, one of the interesting things is these provisions are all located in the administrative chapter, which is chapter subtitle A. We plan on just kind of picking them up and moving them en masse into subtitle C, which is more of the general regulations that apply to properties throughout the District of Columbia. Next slide. So in terms of trying to kind of explain what we're doing, it's kind of easiest to do that by using an example. In this example, a property is split zoned. MU4 is considered the less restrictive or more permissive zone, and R2 is the more restrictive of the two zones. The provision, again, the zoning regulations do kind of address what you can do right now, either by right or by special exception. The provision first establishes the by right process, which allows the transfer of some density from the more restrictive zone, which is the R2 zone, to the less restrictive zone, which is the MU4 zone. The regulations do establish in the low density zones that don't normally deal with density, what that density transfer can be. However, the building bulk allowed in the MU4 portion cannot be moved over onto the R2 portion at all. Actually, maybe if we can go to the next slide, that might show what I'm talking about there. So here's kind of two, obviously very, very simple illustrations where you can see a little bit of shaded portion on the MU4 portion. So a little bit of density from the R2 portion is moved over to MU4. The R2 portion under the current regulations, basically all you can use that for is setbacks, open space, or parking. By special exception, however, under the current regulations, you can, they're a little bit more permissive, but they're also a little bit less clear. It does allow some of the use and density of the less restrictive zone, which in this case is MU4, to be shifted over to the R2 portion of the property. It's a pretty limited amount, and to be honest, we're not really proposing to change that very much. So the drawing under special exception for both kind of the existing and the proposed changes is pretty much the same. So, once again, as Jennifer said, we did look at BZA cases. We found a fair number in this case. There were like 10 cases since the adoption of the 1916 regulations, and all of them were approved. The only changes we're proposing will be to clarify the wording of what you can do. We are proposing to add a little bit more flexibility in terms of the density that is generated on the R2 portion that can be moved over to the MU4A portion through the by right scenario. And again, moving it to subtitle C, which we just think is the more logical place for it. Next slide. This one deals with zoning administrator flexibility. This is all spelled out in subtitle A of the zoning regulations, and we're not proposing significant changes to it. Again, most of the changes we're proposing are just to add some clarity so that people will have a better sense of the kind of flexibility that the zoning administrator does and does not have in different situations. The existing regulations set out zoning administrator flexibility for by right projects, in other words, ones that are going just through a building permit process. And they also set out flexibility that the zoning administrator has for approving building permits that are subject to a zoning commission order and that are subject to a BZA order. We're only really proposing changes and clarifications to the instances where there is a BZA order that the zoning administrator is enforcing through the building permit process. The uncertainty, of course, in terms of how much flexibility there is causes delays to people, to homeowners and businesses as they go through the permitting process. So again, the intent is to provide that clarity. Yeah, that's about it for this one. Next slide. The third case that we're going to bring up, and then we'll break for questions on these three, has to do with light poles in residential zones. Currently, they're regulated in the zoning regulations as a structure, which means that light poles are currently allowed to be a height of up to 90 feet, but they're allowed that height in the residential zones only if they're set back from the property line by a distance equal to that height. And sometimes, as you can imagine, providing that setback for an athletic field or a play field can be practically difficult. So the proposal is to maintain the height provision, but to allow those light standards more flexibility in terms of placement by not requiring that setback. The Department of Parks and Recreation does have some pretty extensive guidelines that they use in terms of design, placement, height, orientation, all those kinds of things, including illumination levels and ways to minimize light spill onto adjacent properties. So those would continue to apply. We're not, by the way, proposing a similar change for athletic fields on university campuses or private school campuses. Both of those are subject to the campus plan provisions and the approval processes before the Zoning Commission and the BZA for those. And so the placement of light poles would be administered through those processes. And next slide. So here we're going to break. As I said, we'll be having these breaks kind of every few slides to receive any comments or thoughts that that you all may have. And if none, thanks. We can move on to the next slide, Joshua. So the next three are dealing with balconies and decks in different situations. And some of them deal with lot occupancy, and this one deals with actual building square footage. Under the current regulations, an inset balcony, which is a balcony that's kind of set into the building as opposed to extending out from the building. It's the one kind of on the bottom right in the illustration on this sheet. An inset balcony actually counts towards the building's gross floor area, even though it's open on at least one side. The only balcony that would, inset balcony that would not count towards FAR is one which has no covering, which would typically just be an inset balcony on the upper level of the building. We've heard lots of requests from the Zoning Commission members as well as from architects to provide additional flexibility in the provision of these kinds of balconies. They can provide important amenity space for residents, and they can also help to provide a facade articulation for the buildings. So we're proposing to exempt inset balconies from FAR. We're still kind of working on what the appropriate depth should be. But right now we're kind of looking at somewhere between about 6 to 8 feet as being the appropriate exemption from FAR for an inset balcony. Next slide. This one deals with lot occupancy and decks, particularly ground floor decks. This might be one of the more consequential changes, and this is one that Zoning Commission members have been asking for, and BZA members have asked for the most and for the longest time. It's taken us a few years to get this one to the Zoning Commission after their first request to deal with this. Currently, uncovered porches and decks that are no more than 4 feet above ground do not count towards lot occupancy. That's the current situation. So for most, for example, flat lots, chances are that your deck, if you want to do a deck, can be done by right, no matter the kind of lot size or the situation on the property. However, for decks that are more than 4 feet in height, or 4 feet in height above the grade, even if they are located off the main or the ground floor level of the building, they do count towards lot occupancy in the current regulations. So that means particularly on sloping lots, but not always, as shown on the bottom diagram here. This is a really frequent issue, and request for relief from this, from lot occupancy for decks, is actually very common. We found well over 100 cases since the adoption of the current regulations in 2016. Most of these decks that were requested by the BZA are relatively small. They're relatively modest in size. Most of them were special exception relief, but others, especially on smaller lots, were variance relief requests. And virtually all of those were approved by the BZA, and almost all of them were supported by OP and by the ANC. So OP is proposing to basically just exempt 200 up to 200 square feet of uncovered open deck off the main floor of the building from the lot occupancy calculation. Anything above that would not receive this would not receive this exemption. So if you wanted to do more deck than that and you didn't have the kind of remaining lot occupancy to do it, you would continue to have to go to the Board of Zoning Adjustment. Our estimates are that something like 80% of the decks that went through the BZA process would have been made conforming by this exemption. And again, the whole point of this is to allow this as an amenity, which is clearly desired by an awful lot of homeowners, while significantly reducing the number of BZA cases that would be required to be filed by those homeowners. And next slide, and then we'll break for questions again. This one has to deal with balconies, which are essentially a lot like decks, but they're on upper levels of the building, and also deals with lot occupancy. Once again, open balconies that extend out from the exterior wall of the building currently count towards lot occupancy. This is not just for houses. This would be for multifamily buildings, which is where we see it the most, and even non-residential buildings. So this one has a bit of a broader application than the last one does. So currently they count towards lot occupancy, and this definitely serves as a disincentive to their provision. Again, zoning commission members in particular have been asking for this amendment for quite some time because they want to encourage balconies both as amenity space for the tenants of those buildings, as well as to provide a greater ability for building articulation. They can also be used to some extent to help add vibrancy to the streetscape, just by having more overlook of the streetscape. So once again, we're proposing to exempt balconies from lot occupancy. Right now, we're looking at 6 feet. We haven't settled on that number. We could make it consistent with some of the other provisions and go up to 8 feet. And in fact, at our last ANC meeting, one of the ANC commissioners actually recommended that it be increased to 8 feet to allow for a balcony that has a much better it's much easier to utilize a balcony of 8 feet for kind of outdoor living purposes than one of 6 feet. So that's why we're considering the 8 feet one. Next slide, and questions. And Mark, I see that you're up.
Yeah, I think you may have just answered my first question. So I'm a little unclear. Are you going to propose 6 or 8? Because your written summary says 6, your slide here says 8. I'm a little unclear on that.
Yeah, like I said, it's something that we're looking at right now because it was raised by another ANC commission member. I think that right now we are probably looking at the 8-foot provision, at least for set down, because when we started to look at some of the past BZA cases and look at some of the buildings, we think that would provide more flexibility and a better amenity for the people who are living in that building.
Just a comment on the ground level decks. 200 square feet is a pretty big deck, I think. And I'll leave the comment at that. But a suggestion for something that you have not listed yet, I don't think it's in your proposed amendments. Right now, as you know, the landings for a staircase leading from the main floor to grade do not count, right? So neither the staircase nor the landing. The problem is it doesn't say anywhere in the regs what a landing is. And we have repeatedly seen people try to drive a truck through that loophole and say, oh, well, this is the landing. It's 4 feet wide and, 16 feet long, basically, much of the width of, or the entire width in some cases, of the house. As long as you're going to be tweaking things, adding clarifications, eliminating ambiguities, I'd recommend that you put a cap on that. I think the building code says a landing has to be 3 by 3, whether you make that 4 by 4, but something needs to be done because right now there is profound uncertainty over where the limit is, if there is a limit on what constitutes such an excluded landing.
It's a great idea. Thank you. Yep. To some extent, of course, the issue might be a little bit less of an issue because that stair landing, could be part of that deck area. But I think that we could certainly make that a little bit more clear in the regulations themselves, so that there's, like I said, one of the objectives of this is to provide a little bit more clarity in the regulations for homeowners, and I think that would be a good one to add. So thanks, Commissioner Duncan.
Hi, my question is on the one regarding the decks, because we see this a lot in most of my area is R1B. My problem with the not including it in the lot coverage is that most of our issues here, when people, mostly developers who build new homes, they make these decks, but then they'll make a walkout basement with a patio underneath, and we have severe problems with stormwater runoff. So when they get to cover more of their lot with impervious surface. So if we were going to not include, decks that are, above 4 feet, I think that we need to make sure that there's like grass or open earth underneath. I don't like this at all. Just as a general thing, like the lot coverage here, we've got serious stormwater runoff with people building houses that are so much larger than they were, originally.
Mhm.
I don't know. I'm uneasy about this one. I might have to read more about it.
Okay, thanks for the comment. We do have separate pervious surface requirements for the low density zones, and we're definitely not proposing to change those. So if the deck was, well, the deck would not be considered, I understand what you're saying, that it's kind of what might happen underneath the deck that is raising some concerns. But we would not be proposing to change those pervious surface requirements.
Okay. I see building plans all the time, and it's always with these spec houses where they'll put this deck on the back, and it just seems to be escaping, I don't know, the plan reviewers. That's obviously it's a different problem. But if you're not changing the pervious surface, I guess that's what we need to keep an eye on. I don't know. I see what you're trying to do, but I'm skeptical.
We'll take a look at that, and we'll take a look at how this might relate to the pervious surface requirement. It's a connection that we'd also kind of looked at a little bit, so we can take a closer look at that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
Commissioner Eckenweiler?
Yeah, if nobody else has other questions or comments, I know I've already had one bite at the apple here. Going back to ground level decks again, whatever area it is, square footage area that you propose, I think you might also want to engraft on that a restriction as to how far back from the rear wall the deck can extend.
Oh, and extend out from the rear wall? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just making notes as we go along so I don't lose them. We are once again, we are taping this, so I will be looking at the tape afterwards, but just want to keep track of these kind of as we're going along. So sorry about that. I'll try to keep this going. And just so you know, we're not proposing to amend rear yard requirements. So if the deck would count towards how the rear yard is measured or a side yard. We're not proposing to change that. Great, thanks. Next slide, Josh. This is a kind of a technical one, an odd one, that comes up from time to time. Currently, well, it's shown in this diagram. Sorry, this has to do with a lot frontage requirement for new subdivisions for multifamily buildings. It's very targeted provision. It applies only to those circumstances. I think what all this slide really shows is what the difference between lot width and lot frontage is, just so that we're all clear on that. Lot frontage is the amount of is kind of the width of the property line at the street, how much street frontage the property has. Defined lot width can be different from that. You know, under the current regulations, the defined lot width is measured differently from that. So for a rectangular lot, your frontage and your width would be the same thing. For a lot where the property lines are askew or odd or, you know, not parallel to each other, lot frontage would not be the same as lot width. We're not proposing to change required lot width, and we're actually not proposing to change the required lot frontage either. But we are proposing to clarify the regulations a bit and make it a bit clearer where and how they apply. And next slide, please. Yes, so once again, the lot frontage requirement is only for a new subdivision for a multifamily building use. Now, a new subdivision can include a lot of things. Clearly, it can include a property that's being subdivided into more than one property, but it can also, a lot subdivision also includes a lot consolidation. So if you take two properties and combine them into one, that's considered a subdivision. Or it can also include the conversion of an existing tax lot to a record lot. So you can have an existing lot that's existed since, you know, 1880. It has a building on it, but it's a tax lot. And in order to do anything on that property, you need to convert it to a record lot. And that's also considered a subdivision. That's what I mean by this is kind of an odd technical kind of one. So we're proposing to clarify, and under the regulations again, if you want to do multifamily development and there's a subdivision proposed, the 30-foot frontage requirement applies. So we're not proposing to eliminate the requirement or to change it from 30 feet to some other amount. We are proposing to make it more clear that it should not be applied to the conversion of a tax lot created prior to 1958. So not a new tax lot, but one that's existed for a while. And we're not proposing, and we are proposing that it not be applied when you're taking an existing building and converting it to a multifamily building as permitted in the RF zones. Mark, I see your video came on. I was going to break for questions in a couple of minutes, but if you have a question about this one, I'm happy to take it now. Proceed on? Okay, thank you. So next slide, Josh. GAR, just very quickly, GAR, green area ratio, it's a relatively recent provision in that it was adopted into the zoning regulations just a little bit before the current ZR16 regulations. And it is intended to address environmental building and site design. However, there is one particular provision within GAR in that it requires GAR review for projects that are only or predominantly for interior renovations of buildings. In other words, they're changing the interior, but it involves little to no substantive change to the external nature of the building or the site. We think this is inconsistent with the description of what GAR is supposed to be. And it can also actually result in some pretty lengthy and expensive administrative burdens for the applicant as well as for review staff. So again, we're simply proposing to clarify that interior alterations like that, ones that don't involve exterior alterations to the building and the site, would not trigger IZ. We're continuing some discussions with DOE about this one. As part of those conversations, DOE staff also raised a couple of other simple little changes, such as how to calculate GAR on a split-zoned lot, those confusing split-zone lots again, as well as they wanted some amendments to the list of certified landscape experts, the people who kind of work on these GAR calculations with DOE. Yeah, so again, pretty technical little change, but one that's important to those particular projects. Next slide, Josh. And here we are. Here we have another break. If you have any questions or comments on those two items. Mark.
Yeah, and just FYI, I recently got the BZA to turn down a variance that turned precisely on this 30-foot lot frontage thing. So it actually matters on occasion. I'm a little puzzled and maybe concerned. You use the word expansions on your slide. And if you're going to exempt expansions, I can't quite tell what's going to be left of this rule. What was happening in our case, we had there was a street front lot with 20 feet of frontage. They were proposing to combine it with a separate record lot at the rear that was much larger. It was going to allow them to do multiple units, more than the by right 2. What do you mean by expansions? I mean, that's an expansion, and this was a terrible project, which we opposed repeatedly. So if you exclude expansions, then what's left of the rule?
Well, and that may be not a good word for us to use here, but it would be expansions in terms of the number of units. In other words, if you're, I think what we probably should have said was conversion from a flat to a multifamily building.
Okay, all right, appreciate the clarification. Thank you.
Any other questions on those two slides? Okay. Next slide, please. We're going to have a couple of slides here about parking, vehicle parking, and then we'll take another break for questions. There's not provision in the ZR16 regulations. Obviously, like the former regulations, they regulate parking requirements based on zones and types of uses. The current regulations state, however, that parking that was required under the old regulations, where the parking requirements tended to be bigger or more, had to be retained for use even if the parking requirement under the new regulations for that building or that use was less. I'm not sure if that's clear. Because it's a very unusual provision. Typically, the zoning requires conformance with the current regulations, not former ones. This provision is basically requiring a conformity in terms of parking with the old regulations for buildings that existed or were built under the old regulations. We're proposing to remove that restriction. We think it's inconsistent with the intent of zoning, but more than that, it can really limit options for updating buildings and even in some cases for converting some of that underutilized parking for other uses, which if it was surface parking, could actually be for the provision of a bit more open space, like green space on the property. This would not, by the way, impact any project which is actually subject to a condition regarding parking, a condition of approval as approved by the zoning commission or BZA. So if a zoning commission case required X number of parking spaces in order for a developer or an owner to reduce the number of spaces, even if it conformed with the current regulations, they would have to go back to the zoning commission for a modification of that order. Next slide. I got a few slides on this one, but we'll go through them relatively quickly. As part of the ZR16 regulations, the commission approved reductions to the required number of parking spaces for sites that are close to a metro station, a streetcar line, or what was currently called the priority metro bus corridor routes. At the time, even then at the time, we noted that the priority bus network would evolve over time. It would likely change, and that would result in some need to change the regulations to be consistent. So we fast forward 9 years, and as some of you may know, WMATA is in the process of implementing a new high-frequency bus corridor network. And that's intended to kind of refine where that particularly frequent bus service is going to happen, where the increased evening and weekend bus service would be happening. And that system is actually going to come into effect on this June, the 29th, so in 3 days. So the timing is right to update the zoning regulations. So we're not proposing to change the amount of the reduction. We're not proposing to change, to expand beyond the WMATA designated routes, but we are proposing to change the routes to correspond to this new system. Next slide. And I know that you can't read this, but again, this is one of those slides that we've included just so that people have it. If they open up the presentation from our website, it lists the new routes, which would be listed in the zoning regulations as the current routes are listed in the zoning regulations. I also realize the maps are small, but those maps will also be up on our website, so people will be able to look at them in a little bit more detail. Just in very general terms, the red lines are the new routes and the light blue lines are the existing routes in the regulations. There's actually a fair amount of overlap that doesn't really show at this scale, but those routes will be available on our website. The WMATA website, by the way, is already pretty fantastic, and it has maps of each one of these routes, as well as a detailed description of where they'd go and the kind of service they're intended to provide. So it's worth taking a look. Next slide. Again, this is going to be pretty hard to see, and I apologize for that, but the final map shows the areas, including the ones, this one includes the areas around metro stations. It's not just the priority bus corridors or high frequency bus corridors, but this shows where the parking reduction would apply. There's a few areas that are shown as kind of pinkish, and those are areas where the parking reduction currently applies, but would not apply under the new WMATA routes. The areas in green are areas that do not really, where the parking reduction does not currently apply, but would apply under these new routes. Of course, as is currently the case, the developer can always choose to provide more parking than required if they feel the demand for that parking exists. And just so that people know, this parking reduction for proximity to a metro station does not apply currently in the RF zones, and OP is not proposing to change that. Next slide. This is another odd provision. And it has to do with the actual garage door height, which is not a thing to regulate in zoning, as well as setbacks from an alley. In the 1958 regulations, the ZR58 regulations, these two requirements applied only to large garages serving, multifamily buildings or offices, things with multiple vehicles. But they did not apply to a parking garage for a low-density residential building like a house, so like a private garage in somebody's backyard. In ZR16, we kind of moved the regulations around a bit, and they were inadvertently applied to all parking structures, including a private garage for a house or flat. And believe it or not, this has actually led to BZA cases for relief from these provisions as people are applying for changes to their accessory building or to their parking. So we're simply proposing to kind of go back to the way it was. We would retain these requirements for the larger parking garages, but we would exempt parking garages for houses and flats from this requirement. Next slide. I'll also go through this one fairly quickly. I think the diagram kind of shows what we're trying to get at here. In the ZR16 regulations, we established screening requirements for surface parking lots, but in the translation, the wording wasn't quite clear enough, and it can be interpreted as actually requiring screening where the car is accessing the parking space from the alley. So we're not proposing to remove the screening requirement around the surface parking, but we are proposing to not require it for where the parking butts up against the alley when the cars are accessing the parking directly from the alley. This kind of parking access is actually pretty common in buildings with a small number of parking spaces, and it's actually a pretty efficient way to provide parking while minimizing, driveway pavement and disturbance to the property itself. There being a fair number of cases actually for relief from this screening requirement. Obviously, all of them have been approved. So it's a very targeted amendment just to remove the screening along the alley itself where the parking is accessed from the alley. Next slide. Another break for questions. If people have questions on these for kind of vehicle parking related changes. Commissioner Duncan?
Yes, I actually want a clarification on the parking one because this is why I'm actually here. So it's my understanding that we're still going to be under the 1958 parking requirements if you are not near any of those Metro bus priority lanes or a metro station.
Happy to clarify that. That's not quite the case.
Okay.
We have new parking standards in ZR16. So if you're not close to a metro station or one of these bus corridors, you'd be subject to the standard parking requirements under ZR16 for that use. And it varies, mostly varies by use. It doesn't vary a lot. As much as under ZR16, it varied a lot by zone. In the 16 regulations, it varies mostly by use. But if you're within one of those areas, close to a high frequency bus corridor metro station, typically your parking requirement is cut in half. So if you're required to provide 50 parking spaces, if you're within one of these areas, your parking requirement would be 25 spaces.
Okay, I'm going to go through a scenario that we just had because ANC 3D has no metro and zero priority bus, even with the new system, not only within our borders, but even like adjacent to our borders. Okay. So we had a existing retail area. There were 3 retail tenants and it's in an MU4 zone and apartments were going above, but they were going to build on top of the apartments. So the retail was subject to the 1958 parking requirements, but the new residential on top went to the 2016 parking requirements. If I'm reading this correctly, if that project were going to go before zoning or BZA today to get approval, that retail at the bottom would be under the 2016 parking regs?
That is correct.
I don't even advocate for parking. Like I usually tell the parking advocates to go pound sand.
I'm not sure I would run for as an ANC commissioner with the vitriol that I would get from this community because the city is not giving us an opportunity to live here without cars. They just took out a protected bike lane. Like we got a protected bike lane put in, and now the mayor is taking it out. If we subject these areas that are transportation deserts with this kind of parking, there's going to be like an uprising. I think that there needs to be a tiered approach. Like, let's put this kind of parking requirement when we get a high frequency bus line down MacArthur Boulevard. And until then, we stick with the 1958. I just,
Okay, well, just to be clear, the 1958 provision would technically apply for the commercial portion of the property.
Yeah.
Because that's the portion that was built under the 1958 regulations.
but that's what just happened. But you're saying that that wouldn't happen under this regulation.
Right, I was just trying to make clear what we were
Yeah,
proposing.
yeah. Okay,
Yeah, so the apartment buildings above would not be subject to the 1958 regulations. They would
And
be
that-
subject to the 2016 regulations.
and we accepted that for this.
Okay,
But he had to add extra parking to keep it for the retail that was there.
got it. Okay.
So that would all now go away. I don't know. I really want new bus service here. Everybody does. Everyone wants better bus here. And if you start doing this before we get bus, like if they want this all over the city, give us better bus. That's what I would be like. ANC 3D is going to vehemently oppose this until we
Okay.
get better bus service. I can just tell you that's what our feedback is. Let's tie it to public transportation. It would be better for our community to have better bus than more parking. But you
Okay.
can't eliminate parking without giving us transportation.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
I'm not 100% sure I'm following.
Okay,
Because
all right,
we're not
so
eliminating parking.
you're
you
not
know,
eliminating
we're still
parking
requiring
requirements.
parking consistent with the
So,
yeah, we're still requiring parking consistent with the 2016 regulations.
right.
So there would be no reduction for parking, if this site is not within one of those corridor areas, there would be not a reduction in parking under those corridor areas. You are correct that if the existing parking on the site is more than what, for the commercial use, is more than what the current regulations would require, then the owner of that property would be able to make that parking conform to the current requirement, which would be the full requirement under the 2016 regulations. And I don't know in this case if there's a difference or not. In some
There
cases
is.
there would be, in some cases there would not. So
I just, one of the reasons why that new 19 unit building above this retail was approved by our commission is because he had to fulfill the parking requirements for that commercial area. I know it seems like splitting hairs here, but for some reason, I feel like one of the reasons this has been proposed is because of this project here. So
no, it's
basically-
not. It's
it's
not.
not?
I'm
Okay.
actually not even sure the project you're talking about.
Okay. We're starting to see a lot of conversions here that keep existing retail, and they're trying to do other stuff on the site, which I'm in full support of. But I don't think, I feel like 90% of the buildings in the city were built before 2016. Like, I feel like this is going to affect a lot of buildings.
It could. It could affect buildings for sure. And honestly, that would be the point. Again, anytime we change the zoning regulations, we require that buildings conform, to those zoning regulations. This one is unusual in that it's requiring a conformance to a different set of zoning regulations altogether.
Yeah, I guess I would, I don't know. I'm gonna look more towards it, but this is one that
Okay.
I don't like across the board.
Got it. No, point well taken. I think I understand your point now, and I totally get it. Thank you.
Okay, thank
Appreciate
you.
the feedback. Thanks. Commissioner Eckenweiler?
Thanks. Yeah, on the alley setback, as I'm sure you recall, Joel, about 4.5 years ago, we went through a whole rulemaking on accessory structures. And I know in RF zones, we went from, in the RF zone regs, we went from 12-foot setback from the center line to 7'5". I take it that what you're saying here is that all of us, and this includes me, just completely overlooked the fact that there was this separate restriction in subtitle C that made that change for RF zones basically completely ineffective, because we, in theory, I guess we still really have a 12-foot setback right now.
Kind of, but not really. And this is where it gets really weird. The 12-foot setback is just to the door. And certainly for a garage, often the door facing the alley is pretty much the whole structure, but not necessarily. So we've actually seen some examples where they've had to set the door back from the rest of the garage, because the garage is set back 7.5 feet from the center line, and then the door has to be set back more than that. So this would mean that the entire building, including the door, would have to conform to that 7.5 foot from the center line of the alley setback.
Okay, thanks for clarification.
Great. Really appreciate those comments, and thanks again, Commissioner Duncan. That's great feedback. Any other thoughts from people on these ones? If not, we'll move forward, Josh. We're getting there. There's a lot of them, and I'm sorry, but I appreciate your patience as we go through them. This is a really super technical one, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. And if people want to talk about this in detail, I'm happy to do so. Essentially, a penthouse on the top of a building, depending on what it is, requires an affordable housing component attached to it. Sometimes that's the inclusion of an accessory unit within the building. We're not proposing to change that. And sometimes, particularly in non-residential buildings, if they do like a community space or a restaurant for a hotel up on the roof, that results in a contribution to the Housing Production Trust Fund, which has been surprisingly successful. I shouldn't say surprising. We knew it'd be important, but the last I heard from DHCD, it had raised over $38 million. This provision alone for penthouses has raised some $38 million towards of contributions and commitments to the trust fund. Anyways, the amount of your contribution or the contribution is really regulated in the regulations, and it's based on things like land area and land value, and certainly total gross floor area of the habitable space. Some of the language is a bit confusing with regards, particularly with regards to some of the service space up on the rooftop, things like stairwells and elevators, and when they count towards that contribution and when they do not. So we're simply proposing to clarify that consistent with the way that it's being interpreted, without really changing the requirement one way or another. So that requirement would obviously continue to be applied to new penthouses. Next provision. Next slide, sorry. And next provision. Also related to inclusionary zoning. You all know about the inclusionary zoning program, so I'm not going to spend time explaining that. Other than to remind us all that there's kind of a mandatory IZ program that typically kicks in for any new development with 10 units or more. There's also kind of a voluntary opting into IZ program for smaller developments, typically ones that aren't meeting that 10 unit threshold, but they do want to use some aspect of the bonuses that are available under IZ. That could be a bit of extra height, or it could be a bit of extra density in most cases. Now, throughout the zoning regulations, that opting in provision applies, and it's by right, except, oh, sorry, I should note that the exception is R1, where IZ does not apply at all. But in most zones, that opting in provision is by right, but in the R2, R3, and RF zones, it's only by special exception. And so we're proposing to remove that special exception requirement so that people could opt into the IZ program by right. It's not something that would come up a lot, but it's just simply an impediment or a disincentive to people utilizing the IZ program where it makes sense. Next slide. Oh, actually, I guess this seemed like a good point for me to break. So any questions on either one of these provisions? Commissioner Duncan? Sorry, you're on mute. Commissioner Duncan?
Sorry, can we go back to the previous slide on the
Sure.
what is it, RA1? I'm seeing here that the case 2508 is a separate proposal, but could you clarify exactly what the difference is between, this is just being able to opt into IZ without having to get a special exception. But right now, does it stand that RA1, no matter what, has to go through this through the BZA, and this is like taking that requirement out if they meet all the zoning regs, like basically allowing them to be by right?
That's a great question, and I should have clarified this. The RA1 is a separate proposal that's already gone to the Zoning Commission for set down. And it's doing exactly the same thing that we're proposing in R2, R3, and the RF zones. That somebody could still opt into the IZ program. Under the current regulations, they have to go to the BZA to get approval to opt into IZ. Under the proposal, they would no longer need relief to opt into IZ. There's still other requirements, especially in RA1, for mandatory BZA review of projects, and those are being kind of administered through that separate text amendment process. But this just deals with the ability to opt into IZ by right or not.
Okay, so just to be clear, the omnibus only has to do with opting into IZ, and all of my other support for the thing, I need to go to that case 2508.
Well, 2508 is also dealing with the opting into IZ question for the RA1 zone.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
So yeah, so in omnibus, we're only dealing with R3, R2, R3, and RF.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and if you wanted to talk about the RA1, I'd be happy to talk to the manager of that case and set up a conversation with you on the RA1 case.
I would very much like that, because we have a big parcel that has just been bought that is RA1, and so I'm very interested in this case.
Yeah, if it's a big parcel, my understanding, and sorry for the rest of you, I'd go off, off topic a little bit. But if it's a very large parcel, my understanding is that they would still require to go through a BZA process if they wanted to do multifamily development on that RA1 property. It would only be very small, it would only be smaller RA1 projects that might be able to go forward by right. But we can talk about the specifics of that site, and I can pull in the project manager with you.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks. And if there's no other questions, we'll go on to the next one. We're getting there. Thanks for hanging in. Um, front front setback relief. This one's pretty straightforward. In the low density residential zones, we relatively recently established a front setback requirement. Unlike a typical yard requirement, like a rear yard or a side yard that has a specific number, like you're allowed a rear yard of, or you're required to provide a rear yard of 20 feet. For the front setback is based on the prevailing frontages of houses on your block. This diagram kind of shows that. That kind of purple shaded area shows the area between the kind of furthest forward house and the furthest back house. And any addition or new building would have to have its front facade somewhere within that purple area. What makes it a little bit, and we're not proposing to change that at all. What makes it unusual is that because it's a setback and not a yard, the current regulations don't allow special exception relief from it. Unlike rear yard, side yard, you actually have to get a variance from this provision, which doesn't seem consistent with the rest of the regulations. So the only change we're proposing is that you would be, if you wanted to get relief from it, you'd be able to do that by special exception instead of variance. Next slide. Getting into some accessory building ones. First of all, accessory building size in the low density zones, low to moderate density zones, the R and the RF. The current regulations establish a maximum building size for an accessory building, and that's 450 square feet, or an area equal to 30% of the required rear yard, whichever is greater. In most cases, other than on very large lots, the 450 square feet is the number that kind of rules, kind of governs. So we've been consistently receiving comments from property owners and from designers that the current 450 square foot limit, which was brought forward from the 1958 regulations, can make it difficult to provide for what they want to put in that accessory building. That's particularly the case because, of course, under the current regulations, you can put a dwelling unit within your accessory building in these zones. It's difficult, or they're saying, and what we've seen is that it's difficult to do a reasonable dwelling unit along with the required parking and vertical circulation and the other things that are needed within the two-story accessory building, which is what accessory buildings are limited to. They're limited to 22 feet and 2 stories in height. And this has definitely been borne out in BZA cases. We found over 30 of them requesting relief from the accessory building size. Most of those included an accessory dwelling unit. So to address this, OP is proposing to increase the permitted size for an accessory building from 450 square feet to 550 square feet in the R3 and RF zones, which the lots tend to be a little bit smaller, sometimes a whole lot smaller, and up to 600 square feet in the R1 and R2 zones. We feel this would provide a more workable size for property owners, but it would also ensure that the accessory building remains secondary in size to the principal building on the property. Next slide. Related to that, we're also proposing some changes to accessory building setbacks. The main one being that right now there is no accessory building setback required from a rear line or a side property line. This has raised some concerns in some BZA cases regarding the impacts, regarding building maintenance, and regarding some privacy concerns. So we're proposing to add a setback to accessory buildings. I will note that the original proposal, what we'd looked at originally, and probably what was in the notice that was sent out to you all, is that we were looking at this for the R and the RF zones. Based on feedback that we've already received, including at the last ANC meeting from some ANC members, it really wasn't working for the RF zones. It was creating kind of unusable odd space left over on the property. It wasn't appropriate in the RF zones. So right now we're looking more at the R zones and proposing a side setback of 3 feet and a rear setback of 5 feet from a rear lot line. And we're proposing this only where that lot line is shared with another adjacent property. So the setback would not be required from a property line along a street or a property line along an alley. Although, as Commissioner Eckenweiler kind of talked about a little bit before, there is the separate requirement for an accessory building from the center line of an alley that would continue to apply. We do understand that this could create, anytime we add a setback, it could make some accessory buildings non-conforming, and it could also make the placement of an accessory building, on a smaller lot more difficult. So as part of this, we would also be proposing to make it clear that somebody could get special exception relief through the BZA from this requirement. Last but not least, and I don't think this affects anybody who's on this call, but it might. There are a couple of zones which already have setbacks for accessory buildings, namely the tree and slope zones and the Georgetown zones. We're not proposing to change the existing setback requirements in those zones. And next slide. Also dealing a little bit with accessory buildings and accessory apartments. And again, this is pretty technical. The accessory apartment provisions, when we put them in, the ability to do an accessory apartment on your property, on a property, was really intended to provide flexibility to owners of properties in the low density zones, the R1 through R3 zones, where only one principal building is permitted on a lot by right. So it was to allow the provision of a second rental unit on the property. The higher density zones like RF, which allows 2 units by right, and the RA and the MU, which allow multiple units by right, already allowed that second unit on the property. So it was not intended that the accessory apartment provisions would apply in these zones, because you can already do it. This is already actually pretty clearly stated in the RF zones, but not so much in the RA and the MU zones, and not even to the extent that we needed in the RF zones. So this has led to a lot of uncertainty and confusion for some property owners, particularly owners of single-family dwellings in the RF and RA zones, and we just wanted to make it much clearer. So to be very clear, the Omnibus, this amendment will include language that'll make it very clear that an accessory apartment is not a permitted use in the RF, RA, or MU zones. This doesn't impact the number of units you can do on those properties. You can still do 2 units in RF and more than that in the other zones. So it doesn't really affect what can be permitted one way or another. But it provides the clarity that hopefully property owners in those areas will need. And next one, and then I think we're going to break for questions again. This one's a little bit different in that, as you all know, as ANC Commission members, zoning regulations are based on comprehensive plan policy direction, full stop. The framework element of the comp plan currently includes a description of each of the future land use map designations, and that description includes a typical floor area ratio and examples of zones for which that FLUM designation is characteristic. In most zones, in the zoning regulations, there is also a description of what the zone is, and in most zones that's consistent with the comprehensive plan description. But there's a couple of zones where that's not the case. So this has resulted in some confusion and uncertainty, particularly with respect to cases that might be going through a planned unit development or zoning map amendment process. So we identified 3 zones where there seems to be a bit of a disconnect right now, and we're proposing to make sure that the zoning description is consistent with what's in the comprehensive plan. So it doesn't affect the density or anything like that. All it affects is that the description would be the same for both documents. And thanks. So questions on these ones? Commissioner Eckenwaller?
Just a really quick comment on accessory building setbacks. Taking RF out of that, very, very, very good idea.
Great, thank you. If there's no others, this is going to be my last set.
I have a question.
Oh, sorry. Oh, I'm sorry.
Commissioner
I'm
Duncan.
sorry. I didn't see your
It's
hand.
okay.
I'm sorry.
It took me a while to find it. The accessory buildings going to 600 square foot footprint. So we find that we get a lot of these because I'm R1B, that the setback from the house to the ADU, it still needs to be 20 feet, correct? We're not changing the setback from the ADU to the back of the house?
Well, there's no specific setback between the house and an accessory dwelling unit. There is in the R1 zones, there's the 25-foot rear yard requirement. And through a complete.
We just had a neighbor come to us saying that they needed relief from that the ADU needed to be 20 feet from the rear yard. Are you saying that's not in the
That's
zoning
what I was
regs?
just getting to. That's what
Okay.
I was just getting to.
Okay, sorry.
There is the rear yard requirement, and because an accessory building can be partially located within a rear yard, that rear yard can become the separation between the two. We're not proposing to change that rear yard requirement through the omnibus. So whatever the regulations require, that would remain. So even though the building under the omnibus would be allowed to be a little bit bigger, there's no changes proposed to either lot occupancy or the principal building setback requirements.
Okay, and so my other, I'm just thinking of cases. So the 3-yard and 5-yard new proposed setback, I think is a good idea because it upsets the neighbors mostly when those ADUs are built right on the property line. Some of our concern, we have a lot of alleys in our ANC also, and there's this one location where there's alleys that are intersecting in a perpendicular fashion.
Mm-hmm. That's pretty common.
Yeah, so we have a hard time there when the ADUs are right on the property line because of you can't see around the corner when cars are coming. So are you saying that the 3 and 5 foot setbacks there don't apply, or they can get a special exception so that we could review it on a case by case basis?
Yeah, no, the proposal as it's currently worded is that the setback that we're proposing would not apply. Now, the setback from the center line of the alley is a separate requirement. So an accessory building, as Commissioner Eckenweiler pointed out, the accessory building has to be set back 7.5 feet from the center line of the alley. So that would continue to apply. But obviously, if your alley is 15 feet wide, the setback from the center line would allow the alley to be on the property line.
Right. Okay. So they wouldn't have to get a special exception. Okay. So that's a little concerning to us.
Okay.
To have the ones that are on the alley where it's at an intersection right on the property line. I don't know. Are kids use those for biking, and that's a little bit concerning.
Got it.
If there was a blind corner at an alley intersection, I guess if I wanted to, I guess I don't care if it's just on a straight alley, but where the alleys intersect, I might care.
Okay, we can certainly take a look at that. That's a bit of a nuanced kind of a comment. So, but I get your point that that's, you know, again, that's not an uncommon situation. We are lots of places that have alleys that intersect, you know, in that way. Interesting comments. So we'll take a look at that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Eckmuller?
Yeah, we don't have any R zones in my ANC, but I have a question. If somebody can build a fence along the lot line, doesn't that present the same problem with, you know, visibility around the corner of the alley?
It does. You know, a fence would result in the same thing. A hedge would result in the same thing. You know, there would be lots of other things that would be allowed to be built. And that's what I meant by saying that we're happy to kind of take a look at that and see what might make the most sense. But there's, yes, you're correct. There's lots of other things that could be on a property line that are not regulated at all in terms of setback. Okay. Next slide. And this is my last grouping. And they're all, or most of them are pretty kind of nuanced and technical. So the first one has to do with Capitol Hill. I'm not sure if we have any commissioners from the Capitol Hill area on the call, but of course. I'm sorry, of course. But this one has to do with penthouse height. And in the cap zones, which are the capital interest zones located generally to the east of the Capitol complex, um, uh, the penthouse is limited to a 10-foot height on all of these buildings, which are allowed to go to a height of 40 feet. In most zones that allow a building of 40-foot height, a penthouse is allowed to be a little bit taller than that, allowed to be 15 feet, which is typically needed for the mechanical space as well as the elevator override. So this has actually created some problems in some buildings in the cap interest overlay area. So we're simply proposing to make the penthouse limits consistent in the Cap Hill area with other areas that allow a 40-foot building height. Of course, if your penthouse is taller, it needs to be set back more because any penthouse needs to be set back 1-to-1. And we wouldn't be proposing to change that 1-to-1 setback requirement. Next slide. And this one deals with the MU and downtown zones. Like most zones, there is a rear yard requirement for these zones. What's a little bit unusual is that there is a very particular special exception process to get relief from the rear yard requirements. And they include some rather complicated and pretty specific criteria related to window placement on your property and on adjacent properties and the proximity with other facing buildings. These have over time proven to be kind of difficult to interpret, difficult to apply, and they're also very different from the requirements with other zones, and we're not quite sure why. They're also, to some extent, redundant of the regular special exception process, which deals with things like privacy, light, and air. So we're not proposing to change the rear yard requirement or to allow things by right that would currently require special exception, just that those very specific criteria be deleted from the regulations to allow the standard special exception criteria to kind of do their thing. Next slide. Now, I know this does affect some of you. This is regarding our neighborhood commercial zones, which exist in many parts of the city. Cleveland Park is one, but also Macomb, Tacoma, 8th Street on Capitol Hill, 8th Street Northeast, and now, as of last night, because the zoning commission approved it, Pennsylvania Avenue Southeast in Ward 7. So these neighborhood commercial zones include specific designated streets, which tend to be the commercial corridor that runs through the zone. And those designated streets have required uses. I think they're called the designated uses that must be provided along that street frontage. And those uses include things like retail, restaurant, arts, general finance, uses like that. We actually had a request. I'm not sure if it's from somebody on this call because I got it kind of secondhand from another staff member. But we had a request that daytime care be added to that list of designated uses. Daytime care is already a permitted use within the zones, but it's not counted as one of those designated uses. We actually think that it's a really great way to provide a diversity of use along those streets and to provide activation of that designated street. So we're happy to take that suggestion and add daytime care as a designated use in the neighborhood commercial zones. Next slide. These ones are just a little bit over the map, all over the map. There are lots of different issues. This one has to do with subtitle U, which is our uses chapter. It establishes the uses in all of our zones, including the uses that are allowed in our residential low density zones. And the principal use in those zones is a principal dwelling unit. A single principal dwelling unit. However, in subtitle U, these zones also include some language regarding the building type that's permitted within that zone, whether it's detached, semi-detached, or attached. So that's a building type. It's not a use. And that building type is actually governed in the development standards of subtitle D. Those types are already all established in subtitle D. So we're just proposing to remove the redundant language in subtitle U because it's misplaced. It doesn't need to be there and shouldn't be there. And so it just kind of is redundant there. So we're proposing to get rid of that. And the last one, next slide. And this is the final one, I promise. And this has to do with an accessory building, a new dwelling unit within an accessory building in the RF zones. So currently, as we all know, the RF zones allow 2 units by right on a property. And in 2016, we added language that makes it clear that one of those 2 units can be in an accessory building on the property. That can be a rental unit or it can be a second principal unit. That's up to the owner of the property. When we put this provision in, though, there were some concerns from some members of the community that led to a restriction on a homeowner's right to take advantage of that provision, in that there are restrictions that require that if you're going to put a dwelling unit in an accessory building, the accessory building had to have been constructed prior to 2013. Don't even remember where that date came from. And also that the expansion of an existing accessory building to add an accessory dwelling would require special exception review. Clearly, this serves to limit the flexibility of owners wishing to provide a second unit on their property, so it's inconsistent with housing policy and inconsistent with the intent of the zone, we think. We found more cases than I remembered for exactly this relief. We found some 25 cases. All of them were approved. And so we're proposing to remove those 2 restrictions. Other restrictions related to the accessory building and to the accessory use would continue to apply. It's just these 2 provisions about kind of the pre-existing nature of the accessory building that we would recommend to, we'll be recommending to delete. Next slide. And that's it. So any questions on this final grouping of proposed text amendments? Commissioner Eckenweiler.
Joel, I have a couple suggestions, not on
Sure.
any of these, so I'm happy to hold that if other people have comments or questions on these five.
Great. Okay, thanks. Not seeing any. I'm I'm happy to take your your comments, Mark.
Okay, stop me if you've heard me say this before, because you absolutely have, both in person and, well, virtually and in writing. There are two issues we've raised repeatedly in comments to OP, in correspondence with the zoning commission. One is what used to be E206, now E204, the treatment of rooftop architectural elements, and how the ZA is treating cornices. And I'm just going to put in a pitch again, which will probably be kicked down the road again, but this really needs to be dealt with. Honestly, the zoning commission asked OP to look at this and to work with 6C on this, and that has not happened. So I'm just putting in a plug for that again. And then separately, something that keeps coming up, we just had a case where the BZA voted last week to deny. We've got another one that's coming to the ANC next week, where we have applicants for relief for things that were already built. And my idea is not that those should just be, knocked out of the box right away, because people can make good faith mistakes. But there needs to be some language somewhere that tells the board that either they can, or in certain cases must, take account of what is demonstrably bad faith. And let me give you an example of that. In both of these cases, the building permit file makes it abundantly clear that these people applied for one thing, were told either, overtly or, implicitly, you can't build that. And they got a permit for a different thing. And then they went ahead and they built the thing that they really wanted anyway, notwithstanding the fact that they had effectively been denied a permit for that. And part of the reason I raise this here is there's a really, really bad set of incentives. The reason these things keep happening is flippers are perfectly willing to roll the dice. Most of the time, they're not going to get caught. If they get caught, maybe something happens, maybe not. There need to be more severe consequences. And honestly, I don't think the board should be granting relief for people who have behaved so overtly badly. So something for you to think about. It is an ongoing problem. It's the reason that, frankly, we keep seeing a lot of these after the fact applications going to BZA, because this is how people behave in the real world. And I'll pause there. If you have questions, happy to answer, but I think you get my drift.
I do. Thank you. Happy to take those suggestions. Mr. Brandt?
Hi, Mr. Lawson. Thanks so much for this. This was really helpful. I just thought I would chime in and just mention that I'm not a commissioner, but I am the chair of the Zoning Preservation Development Committee for ANC 1B. We've had a similar, it doesn't sound quite as extensive as what the gentleman was just saying, but we've had some similar cases where people have just done work before getting permission and then have gone back and applied for things that they've already done. And thankfully, none of them have been really, they all would be things that we would have said yes to had they gone through the right process. And so they weren't like necessarily problems, but it does strike me that that's like a bad precedent for us to be dealing with or setting, I guess. So yeah, anyway, I thought I would just chime in and say we've noticed it too.
No, appreciate that. Thank you. Any other questions or comments at this point? I saw that somebody asked about the slides. We certainly can send those out to you. They'll also be available up on our website. So what we'll probably do is send out to people a link to the website where the presentation will be available. That's probably the easiest and won't clog up everybody's email quite as much. So we'll make sure we get that out to you as soon as possible. Next slide, Joshua. This just talks a little bit about the process. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jennifer.
No, you're already handling it. Go ahead.
Okay. This just talks a little bit about, and I think you all know this. The process we're going to be going through. We're still very, very early in the process for both of these text amendment cases. Thank you once again for participating in these open houses. We really appreciate your feedback and your thoughts and your comments. The next step for us will be to prepare the Zoning Commission report, which will include draft text for forwarding to the Zoning Commission for setting down for a public hearing. Once that's done, we will be sending that out to people, so you'll be aware that the report's filed and what's in the report, because obviously we've only kind of talked about things at a very high level today and at our last ANC meeting, and there's a lot more detail in the actual text. The Zoning Commission set down, we're shooting towards having a set down in July, and that means that there will be most likely public hearings, as I said, later in the fall. It could be October, but at this point, we're not quite sure, obviously. But in between those times, of course, we'll also be available for more discussions and receiving any thoughts that you all may have on any or all of these proposed amendments. Next slide. And this is it. Once again, the information is going to be up on our website. If you think of other things that you wish you had talked about today and you would like to, honestly, the best way to reach us is through these dedicated email addresses, the Rear Edition and the Omnibus. That's how we sent the invitation out to you. So you can just reply to those. And obviously, we would love to get them. Yeah, so you'll be hearing more from us. If you have more information for us, please feel free to reach out. We love to receive it. So thank you. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Mark.
Sure, Joel, just one quick thing on the parallel rulemaking in 2506 for alley lots. Will you be sending out a notice when the ZC hearing date is set for that?
Yeah, the Office of Zoning will be sending out its regular notice, but we can also send out an email to make sure that everybody gets it.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, as far as I know, there's not a hearing date set yet.
There is not. I checked this morning.
Okay. Yeah. Great. Well, thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Try to stay cool. And thanks once again for helping us out with this. Bye now.